another video where we're talking about the way the early church is described in the book of Acts, chapters 2 and 4. And today we're going to focus on the 4 practices or 4 key activities that comprise the life of the church community and how they might relate to a common life of discipleship. In chapter 2, I believe, it lists these activities. The people devoted themselves to the teaching of the apostles, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer.
So those are 4 activities, a concise little list, and we're going to work through each of them. So number 1, the teaching of the apostles, which was lent authority by the miraculous signs and healings that the apostles performed, or rather were performed through them. Like the author says at the beginning of Acts, in his first book, the Gospel of Luke, he wrote what Jesus began to do. And you can see Acts as a continuation of that through the apostles, Jesus working through the apostles. Now, wonders and signs of that nature can feel far off today. It's not something you generally see or hear about.
And although if you read, for example, accounts of 19th century pastor Johann Christoph Blumhardt, he was a German pastor whose congregation resided in a small village, but he actually experienced a great number of miraculous occurrences, healings, and the like during a religious awakening. It's not as if these gifts have been entirely absent since the early church, and I think with the rise of technology, we forget that, and we're kind of more skeptical maybe.
Sure, but I'm sure possibly some viewers have experiences of that nature, and it's absolutely true. But let's talk a bit about what the teachings of the apostles were. Now, we can assume they were passing on stories of Jesus that they'd experienced, and they were probably also concerned with church order and how the church was organized, how things were done.
We actually have a pretty good clue from an early Christian document called the Didache, which is also known as the Lord's teaching through the 12 apostles. The most memorable section is a teaching about the 2 ways, the way of life and the way of death. It's a document we frequently refer to on the Bruderhof, and it's very meaningful to the members here.
It's filled with a lot of actually pretty stern admonitions, but also very encouraging. So clearly it's important for a community of believers to continue to immerse themselves in the gospel message. That's to keep one another on the right path, to avoid false teachings, which can easily come in, and then to remind each other of the significance and meaning of rituals, sacraments like baptism, prayer, and the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. So that's number 1 of the 4 activities, Doreen.
Yes, so let's move on to the second of the activities, and that is fellowship. And that's pretty easy to understand. But fellowship kind of requires being in the same place, at least I think. And I think most of us can agree that virtual fellowship is pretty subpar.
Very.
Yeah. And fellowship isn't just about camaraderie or drinking coffee, having brunch, playing ultimate frisbee, whatever you're into. It's more intentional than that. Probably most people are familiar with the term koinonia, which a lot of people translate as fellowship. But according to McKeel C. Parsons in his commentary on Acts, it's better translated as common life. And that's really a more muscular term in the narrative of Acts than in its popular contemporary Christian parlance. So it seems that this common life meant really being there for each other and sharing in all aspects of life, spiritual, cultural, and also material.
Right. The third of the activities is the breaking of bread. Now, Parsons in his commentary also notes that breaking bread is Lucan shorthand for the Lord's Supper. And he points out that more than any other of the gospel accounts, Luke's gospel regularly depicts Jesus at table. And one commentator even said that in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is either going to, coming from, or at a meal. So the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist remains a central ritual for probably all Christian denominations that I'm aware of. For us in the Bruderhof, it's a meal of remembrance. We remember Christ's life, death, resurrection, and promised return. And it's a meal of communion with Christ. It's also a meal of unity. We feel of one heart with each other and are at peace. We make sure there's peace between us before we celebrate it. And it's also a meal of thanksgiving.
But beyond the Lord's Supper, I think breaking of bread also refers simply to meals we share together. Like Rich said, shared meals are a frequently reoccurring happening in the Gospels, and I think that's instructive for us. Food is essential for survival, and sharing it with others is a joyful way of practicing hospitality and also an opportunity for giving thanks together. In Acts it says, they ate their food with glad and generous hearts. So sharing a meal with people beyond your own family really can be a festival of community, which foreshadows the wedding feast Jesus spoke of when the whole world will be invited.
Yeah.
And that will be the most joyous event.
Yeah. It's a beautiful picture. The fourth and final activity is prayer. Now, prayer can take many forms. At the time of the early church, prayer obviously consisted of the Lord's Prayer, but probably also the Psalms were used in prayers. That was part of the Jewish tradition, which continued in the early church. And those daily forms of prayer, whether individually or as a community of believers, remain vital. But we found prayer can also be silent, or it can take place through singing and music. And even work can be a form of prayer if it's directed toward God and to others. So obviously much more can be said about any of these activities, but each of them point to thick community, involved community, fellowship with others. They're not things you can do by yourself. Well, I guess you can pray by yourself, but the point remains.
I would be really interested, or it would be interesting to hear from folks in the comments the different ways they experience these 4 activities, because they are activities. You're doing something: teaching, fellowship, breaking bread, prayer, and what you found to be the most meaningful. So if you have any thoughts or questions on this, make sure to drop them in the comments, and we really appreciate hearing your feedback. Thanks for watching.